Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 5th of June, where we are talking about persuasion and also talking about paper number 1. So, last class, I spent a good amount of time talking a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper. And if you remember in the syllabus, I had included a essay evaluation guideline to give you a sense of the differences between an A, which is excellent, and a B, which is very good, and a C, which is satisfactory. And I just wanted to review those with you. That the A paper, and again, this is in the syllabus, develops a clear central idea. In other words, what we were talking about with thesis, with originality and depth of thought, and displays a consistent sense of audience. Its topic is developed with clear and logical supporting ideas. And we talked a little bit about this last class as well, about the importance of giving evidence to support your position. The organization is sound. Each paragraph has a core idea supported by fitting examples and illustrations. Paragraphs are joined to those following and those before with smooth links. In other words, you've got transitions to connect your ideas. Sentences are well put together and varied, and it's generally free of common errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. So that would be an A or an excellent, as opposed to a B or a good. The B paper has a clearly stated central idea, but it doesn't have the energy or the depth of thought of an A. It draws safe conclusions, but the topic is interesting, it's focused adequately, and it's logically developed. Organization is correct and logical, but it sometimes strains a little bit. So sometimes it's not clear how things are connected to one another. Each paragraph has a central idea, examples, or illustrations, and a logical point. And some of the transitions between the paragraphs are smooth, but not necessarily all of the transitions or connections are smooth. Sentences tend to have little variety in structure, and it's largely free of errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. And then if we were to go to the C paper, which is satisfactory, it has a reasonably clear central idea and shows an adequate grasp of the reason for the assignment, such as direction or description or persuasion. In other words, it answers the essay topic. But the focus is blurred in some places. The development with examples or illustrations is sketchy in some spots. Organization isn't always clear. While most paragraphs have a sense of organization, the development is vague. Transitions between paragraphs are awkward or even lacking. And now we're beginning to see patterns of mistakes in grammar, spelling, and punctuation. The D paper, or less than satisfactory, it doesn't state or develop a central idea, though the pattern shows the writer has some central concept. The sense of audience is inconsistent. Organization is hard to follow, and frequently paragraphs seem to lack a central idea. Transitions between paragraphs are scanty or absent. And sentences are awkward, incorrectly constructed, and there are frequent errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. And then the F paper, unsatisfactory. The F paper states no central idea, has no connection to a single topic. The writing is contradictory, characterized by many changes of subject, and there's no evidence of overall editing or writing beyond really a first draft. So, as you know, you all have the ability to rewrite the first paper, and that's deliberate so that you can see the first paper as a kind of learning exercise, if you will. And that first paper would ideally be submitted in next Thursday, a week from today. So if you're watching this video on Thursday, so that would be the 12th. That's the target date that I put on the syllabus, which would have given us enough time to have finished our discussions about Frankenstein and persuasion, which I suspect most of you will be choosing for your paper, though the story of an hour is also an option. Though writing about a short story means that you're going to have to be a lot more specific in terms of your analysis, and because ultimately you just don't have as much text. So you need to look at anything and everything that would seem to be important. And while I've offered you a general idea of a topic, you can create your own topic, but you do need to get it approved by me. And in fact, today's attendance question is going to be related to this upcoming first paper. And I wanted you to begin thinking about how you could proceed with that first paper. So for our discussion forum, which would be due Saturday on the 7th, and again, you can ask for an extension if you need additional time. My question is, do you have an idea of what you will write about for paper number 1? And if so, what is that idea? So I've kept it pretty broad, and you are certainly not committed if you bring forth an idea and then change your mind. But as you know, the summer session is very condensed. And while certainly you could hand in a paper after our target due date, my hope is that all of you submit in a paper by the target due date or even beforehand, because the semester goes very, very quickly. And what I will do is I will evaluate those papers and put a letter grade on it and return them to you. And you, if you're content with your grade, you're done with the assignment. But if not, you can rewrite your paper incorporating my suggestions. And if you need further direction, you can always reach out to me and we can talk a little bit more about that. And that you hand in your revision along with the original evaluated copy from me so I can compare and contrast. And you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And your second paper, which is going to be due at the ending of the semester, will probably be devoted to the last works that we will be reading. That said, we know that Jane Eyre kind of straddles both the first and the second paper. And I have no problems with you writing about Jane Eyre for the first paper, but you certainly wouldn't want to write about Jane Eyre for both the first and the second paper. So you want each paper to be about a different text. But as you know, we'll be in the midst of our conversation about Jane Eyre next Thursday, so you may not necessarily feel comfortable submitting in a paper number 1 on Jane Eyre when we haven't necessarily concluded our class discussions about Jane Eyre, which is why I suspect most of you would be talking about Frankenstein, Persuasion, or perhaps The Story of an Hour. But do think about what it is you want to do for that first paper. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, though you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you an idea of the kind of class conversation we would have had about ideas and possibilities for the first paper. Though, as you can see from our discussion forum, we are a relatively small class. We've got about 9 people in the class. So we could have had as many as 25. And there are pros and cons to having a small class. But regardless, we do know that the semester will end, believe it or not, in early to mid-July. So where we are now is talking about Persuasion, which is perhaps a more challenging text than some of the other texts in the semester, because the world of privilege that it examines might be far removed from your and my personal experiences, but I've always viewed it as a kind of history lesson in some respects. And also the pace is quite slow, and deliberately so, to kind of illustrate the lifestyle of those individuals who have a certain level of privilege. And there are many characters in the text, so much so that what I had suggested is that you keep a list of the characters. And you can see in the notes below, I've done just that. After I've talked a little bit about how Persuasion is a romance novel, but it's also a satire. So we see the critique of this world of leisure. It's all about manners. It's all about decorum. It's all about appearances. It's all very superficial in many respects. And the Elliot family is a microcosm of this world. That said, one of the major elements or themes, I should say, in this text, as in perhaps just about all texts of literature, is about the importance of balance and compromise. But in the second section is where I've begun to detail some of the major characters. And I've divided up the characters by gender. First the male and then the female, but there are lots of different ways you could divide up these characters, whether it be by familial relations, whether it be by age, whether it be by status. But if we were to talk about male characters, our central male character is Sir Walter Elliot. Now, the title of Sir in England is an honorary title. You might be familiar with this perhaps with some media personalities who sometimes are granted the title of Sir, such as Sir Ian McClellan, an actor who was granted the title of Sir. It's a title of honor and respect that's granted by the king or queen at the time. So Sir Walter Elliot has a certain level of status because he has this title. And he is a widower. And the biggest question in the text for him is he going to remarry? He has no male heirs. The beginning of the novel talks about how he's reviewing his family history, the Bartonage, and in reviewing his family history, we find out that he had a young son who had died. So ultimately, he's left with daughters. So if he were to remarry and he were to provide a male heir to the family line, that male heir would inherit all of the property. So we learned that Charles Musgrove, notice no title of Sir, is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter. Sir Walter's youngest daughter is Mary. And that said, Mary is very much like a female would be expected to be in the cult of true womanhood, but with all of the negative and none of the positive qualities. So she is very self-centered. She's very fragile. She is oftentimes suffering from what was known as the vapors, overcome, constantly needing attention, and so forth. Now, the thing is that Charles Musgrove, Mary's husband, had once proposed to Anne, who is our narrator and is Sir Walter Elliot's middle daughter. So can you imagine the tension that was going on between these two sisters, where Charles Musgrove had first wanted Anne and decided to settle for lack of a better expression, Mary. So there is that undercurrent between the two sisters. Now, Frederick Wentworth, and notice his last name, Wentworth, he went and found his worth. He was once Anne's suitor, and Anne was persuaded, and notice how persuasion is such a major element throughout the text, not to marry him because he was not a suitable match, because he hadn't earned fortune yet and he didn't have status. And of course, that was the primary motivator for marriage within these social circles. He is the brother to Mrs. Croft. So this is a character that we will be introduced to later on. In fact, everybody is connected to everybody else. And if you think about the limitations of travel at the time, it's not too surprising that one social circle would be relatively small. Something that could be reached by horseback, for instance. So Frederick Wentworth has come back after he went and found his worth. So now he has a fortune. So now he's a good catch, so to speak. And he is single. So the major question in the text is, who will he court and who, more importantly, will he marry? So it's all a question of finding who's eligible and who's a suitable match. Now, William Elliot, Esquire, is the cousin in the Elliot family. It's assumed that he will be the heir presumptive. He is the closest male relation to Sir Walter Elliot. And eventually we find out, and I hope I'm not giving away spoilers if you haven't finished the novel yet, he courts Anne. And that's one of the major conflicts in the text, is why he decides to court Anne and how she responds to that. There is a Mr. Musgrove, and this is Charles Musgrove's father. So we know that, again, Charles Musgrove is married to Mary, Sir Walter Elliot's younger daughter. He's only a Mr. He does not have the title of Sir. There's an Admiral Croft. Remember, we talked a little bit about Mrs. Croft. Her husband is Admiral Croft. He rents Kellynch Hall from Sir Walter. Now, Admiral Croft is an interesting character because he has a certain level of status in that he has earned it through the military, the Navy. He's become an admiral. And that's one of the things that Sir Walter Elliot is not too happy about, that society is changing and that birthright alone is not necessarily determining one's position within society. However, Sir Walter, being very self-centered and also being very poor at this point, at least in relation to what he's accustomed to, finds that he can no longer maintain his residence, Kellynch Hall. So he is going to rent it out, but he wants to rent it out to a suitable tenant, to somebody who wouldn't be embarrassing, so it wouldn't seem as if Sir Walter Elliot was renting out because of financial difficulties, that he's renting out merely because he's going to be going on vacation to Bath, which was a popular vacation spot at the time. So that is the plan that the family comes up with to save face, and saving face is so important. So Admiral Croft has enough status, but not too much status, so that he's going to overshadow Sir Walter Elliot. And we know through Admiral Croft that we're introduced to other Navy men who have achieved a certain level of rank or status in the military. One is Captain Harville. This is Frederick Wentworth's friend, who happens to, of course, be married. There's Captain Benwick, who happens to be the friend of Captain Harville, and he's single. He had a fiancée. She died. And the main question here is that, will he court again? And what's the proper period for mourning? And what is the proper period, too, for engagement before marrying? And then we have Charles Hayter, who is a Musgrove family cousin. Again, not unusual for cousins to marry within families. He's single and he's courting Henrietta, who happens to be single and available. And as we look at the third section with our female characters, we find out not just about Henrietta, who is the daughter of the Musgroves and Charles Musgrove's sister, but we find out about Elizabeth Elliot. This is Sir Walter's oldest daughter, and she is single, but it doesn't seem like it's a major concern at this point, that eventually she will marry, and she's serving a very useful purpose for Sir Walter. She basically has taken on the role of caretaker now that Sir Walter is a widower. However, Anne Elliot, even though she's younger, there's major concern that she's still single, because who would ever want to court her? And as we're told throughout the book, she's lost her bloom. In other words, she's lost her beauty. And the importance of female having youth and beauty in order to be seen as desirable, as well as status, and hopefully some finances as well, is definitely evident within the text. There's Mary Musgrove, again, which we've talked about. She's Sir Walter's youngest daughter. She married Charles Musgrove. There's Lady Russell. She's an incredibly interesting character. Notice that she has a title of lady, and she's a family friend and serves as a mother figure to Anne. She is a widow, and she's not courting anybody, and probably not surprising that she's not courting anybody, because as a widow and without having children, it seems that she is in a financially comfortable place, so she wouldn't need to marry for financial considerations, which was usually a major motivator for marriage, particularly within this social class. So note that, once again, we've got a motherless main character. We saw this in Frankenstein with Victor, and now we are seeing this as well with Anne Elliot. Lady Russell was the one who had convinced Anne not to marry Frederick Wentworth. So even though Lady Russell has good intentions, it doesn't necessarily mean that she always makes the right choices. But she wanted to protect Anne. There's Mrs. Musgrove. This is Charles Musgrove's mother, and she, of course, is married. There's Louisa Musgrove, because the Musgroves have other children outside of Charles, and Louisa is one of the daughters of the Musgroves. obviously the sister to Charles Musgrove, and she's at one point courted by Wentworth. So there's tension in the novel between whether or not Wentworth is going to go back to Anne or whether or not Wentworth is going to go with Louisa. And Louisa and Anne are two very different kinds of women. Louisa is known for having a very strong will, but as we will find out, and again, I hope I'm not giving spoilers, that too much of anything, whether it's being too persuadable or being too independent, is a bad thing. And Louisa's strong will ultimately be seen as a negative. There's Henrietta Musgrove, again, the daughter of the Musgroves and the sister, again, of Charles Musgrove. And she also is single. So the major question is, who is she going to be with? She's being courted by the family cousin, Charles Hayter, with some concerns. You know, he doesn't necessarily have status, but he's going into the clergy, but at least that is a profession that comes with a certain level of respect. Keep this in mind as well when we read Jane Eyre. There's another character, Mrs. Clay, and think about how Clay is so easily moldable, and that'll tell you a little bit about her character. She is Elizabeth's friend, Elizabeth being the oldest daughter, and Mrs. Clay is the daughter to Mr. Shepherd. Notice Mr. Shepherd does not have the title of Sir. Mr. Shepherd is merely the family attorney. That's how they're connected with the Elliot family. The fear is that Mrs. Clay, who is a widow, will be in one way or another courting Sir Walter, and if so, will she convince Sir Walter to marry her? And does she have financial designs on Sir Walter? Because she really isn't clear on some of the financial challenges the family is facing. There's Mrs. Smith. And think about the last name of Smith. It's very common and very ordinary. This ends up being a very close friend of Anne's that we're introduced to later on in the book. She also is a widow, and that would be the appropriate way to be single if you had already been married. Divorce obviously not being that kind of option. She's not courting anybody, and the problem with Mrs. Smith is that she's pretty close to destitute, and she doesn't have any strong male figures in her life to protect her or to work in her favor. So there is going to be a good amount of tension between Anne and her family about why Anne insists on spending time with somebody who has no status and who has no money and has no familial connections. And there's Mrs. Croft, who of course is married to Admiral Croft. They rent Kellynch Hall, and coincidentally perhaps, they are related to Frederick Wentworth. Mrs. Croft is Frederick Wentworth's sister. But again, perhaps not that much of a stretch of the imagination, considering that most of the people you knew would be living within close proximity to one another and would have some sort of a familial tie. So all of these characters are supplemented by some minor characters, and this is in the 4th section in the notes below. There's a Viscountess Dalrymple. Now, Viscountess is a level of nobility. So when we are introduced to the Viscountess, we will see somebody who's higher up in status than Sir Walter and see how he responds to somebody who's higher than his status, because he's used to interacting with people of his status or lower than his status, which allows him to keep a certain level of superiority, which is important for him. He's very vain. One of the things we're told about is how important appearances are to him, physical appearances, both his own and also the people who are important in his life. And finally, there's Mr. Shepherd, who is the family attorney, who is, again, the father to Mrs. Clay, which happens to be the friend of the eldest daughter, and that happens to be Elizabeth. So, keeping these characters straight will be very helpful in terms of your getting a sense as to what's happening. And the novel is divided into two pieces with the major action happening with a fall off of a wall. Again, I don't necessarily want to give away too many spoilers if you haven't finished reading the novel yet, but I would expect that you would be done with it by our next class so that we can talk a little bit more about some of the important elements that are occurring within persuasion. And note how often the idea of falling, whether you're falling in love or you are off balance and you're falling off of a structure, is referenced within the novel. Again, the importance of being able to keep balance and moderation as a theme that's developed throughout. And while, again, we've got a somewhat progressive author in that this author is critiquing this society, this author is also a product of her society, much like we saw with Frankenstein. So you will definitely see a Eurocentric bias in this text. Now, again, for our attendance question, thinking about paper number 1, which you may have already decided that you're going to write on Frankenstein or you're going to write on the story of an hour, or you might be contemplating the idea of persuasion, but we still have some more conversation to go with persuasion. And in the interim, our longest text, Jane Eyre, you can see that in the 5th section in the notes below, I have included a web link for that for you to begin it. And again, it is our longest book, but it is by far, I think, the most interesting outside of The Awakening, which happens to be perhaps my favorite text of the semester. But lots of action happens in Jane Eyre, and what we see is poverty, or at least what is considered to be poverty in the context of, let's say, the Elliot family, where Jane Eyre is an orphan and basically has no familial connections to help support her and has to go to a boarding school and learn how to support herself. Or at least that's part of the novel. Again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers. But that status, of course, puts her below the Elliot family. And of course, we talked about Victor Frankenstein, and they come from also a very privileged upbringing, but certainly not at the level of the Elliot family. So you can see we've got different ranks or different levels of socioeconomic status that we've been examining. But we'll get to the lowest level of socioeconomic status when we discuss incidents in the life of a slave girl, where we talk about not the poor, but we talk about slaves. But for now, I'm curious to see what you wanted to write about for paper number 1. Next class, we'll finish up with persuasion. Might have a few odds and ends to talk about with Frankenstein because I still have yet to read your discussion forum responses about important quotes, but I've read all of the other responses thus far. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.